It's a lovely Sunday morning here at the monastery, although we don't hardly even know it's Sunday. I'm looking out the window. I'm here in the library. And it's beautiful. It's sunny out there. It's a little hot, but no big deal. Hasn't been too bad of a summer. And I'm really happy to be talking to you all again. It's been quite a while since I've had any communication really with the TBC. So it's great. I get to see Lynn and Jeff and Tim and some other people here, Eleanor before the meeting started, and now to see you all, your little faces in the gallery. That's good. It's good that we have this, even this kind of artificial way of getting together. It's still pretty nice. So as a Dhamma reflection this morning, it's always kind of, I never know what to say. But maybe some thoughts about some reading that I've been doing lately. I like to read the suttas. So I was reading in the Anguttara Nikaya, and this morning we had a reading out of the Samyutta Nikaya. And most of these things I've read before, and that's the interesting thing about the Dhamma. Everything that I'm going to say this morning, you've probably heard it before. We hear the Dhamma over and over again, and even after we've heard it, in a way, it doesn't really get old. If we're practicing and we're sincere in our practice, we're going to notice that practice kind of has ups and downs. It has peaks and valleys. It waxes and wanes. Sometimes we're inspired, and sometimes we're despairing. And this alternation between up and down is kind of normal. Everybody's practice seems to go through periods like that. And that's part of the reason it's helpful and important to have spiritual friends, spiritual companions, to share words of Dhamma, even if you've heard them before, even if you've heard them before hundreds of times, just like the chanting. Every time you hear it, you can retune your mind, you can reconnect to the beauty and the power that the Dhamma has in it. And so the words themselves might sound repetitive. There's a lot of repetition in the canon. But you never really know when you're going to be ready to hear a particular passage or connect with a particular teaching. So you just keep listening and listening, and from time to time you'll just catch a phrase, or you'll hear something again, and you'll get it from a different perspective, or you'll see it more clearly. You'll understand something you didn't understand before. So in this way, the Dhamma never really gets old. As long as you're practicing, you'll keep hearing new, amazing depths in the Dhamma. So the passage that we were going over this morning, it had to do with the Buddha being on retreat in, I think it was the squirrel sanctuary, one of the groves that he used to practice in. So imagine a deep forest grove with lots of big trees, and he's practicing at night, meditating at the root of a tree or his hut or whatever he's using for a dwelling. And he's approached by a deva. And whenever Buddha would get approached by devas, invariably the canon recites that recollects that the deva illuminates the entire grove. So the deva is this presence which comes into the Buddha's presence and seems to cast a physical light into the space. And not everybody likes to hear about devas. And I used to be that way. I didn't really like to hear about devas because I couldn't quite wrap my head around the idea that there are these celestial beings who would come and light up a grove. It sounds too maybe too superstitious. angels and ghosts and demons, devas, they kind of fall into this category of experiences that I've never had, nor do I know anybody who's had them. Or I have to take that back now. Now that I'm a monk, I've actually met people who've encountered devas. So, and my skepticism is becoming less rigid. But the first time I encountered devas in my readings was I was still working in Silicon Valley. I was still working for an engineering firm, and still living very much a very secular life. So after a long immersion in the tradition, devas are seeming a lot more feasible to me. But at the time, now, I still see devas as representing both an internal and an external aspect of something that the Buddha himself is contemplating. So when the Buddha is contemplating something, that very thought of the thing that he's contemplating is as if illuminates the grove. It lights up his brain, so to speak, and that casts a brilliance into the world. So anyways, this deva, whose name I think was Sotisa, he comes to the Buddha, and he has, as they usually do, he has some kind of a question, or he's going to make some sort of observation. And his question is about the world and the escape from the world. And this, of course, is a metaphor or a way of thinking about what the Buddha himself is teaching, what the Dhamma is teaching. So he asked the Buddha, Lord, is there a place where there is no being born and no dying, no coming and no going, no arising and passing away? And can this place be arrived at by traveling? Can one travel to this place by walking or some other mode of transportation? How does one get to this world where there are no such things as coming and going, rising and passing away, birth and death? And the Buddha says in response, there is such a place where there is no coming and going, where there is no birth and death, where there is no rising and passing away. And of course, this place that he's referring to, the tradition takes to be Nibbana. And so I'll maybe talk about that a little bit more here in just a moment, but just to carry on with the story. So there's this place that has these characteristics, but it's not possible to arrive there by traveling. One cannot travel the world and find this place. But instead, I declare that the world is this, he says, this fathom-long carcass is the world in which this place is to be found. So he as he cleverly often does, he sort of inverts the perception of what it is we're talking about here. The world we normally take to be that which is external to us, that we're a unitary being of some sort, finding ourselves inside this world with all of its manifestations. Its people and its places and its past and its future, its politics, its tragedy, its crises, its joys and its wonders. This is the world. It's all outside of us. And the Buddha is saying, no, the world is this fathom-long carcass. And he actually intentionally uses a somewhat he refers to the body in a way that doesn't praise it. Right? He's calling it a carcass. He's putting it sort of in the place of it's simply form that we're connected to, that we're experiencing. This body is not who we are, but it is what we have to work with. And he says this fathom-long carcass, and I believe he says with its senses and its consciousness. So we have these 6 sense organs, taste, touch, smell, hearing, feeling, and consciousness itself, knowing. These are the sense doors, the 6 sense doors in Buddhism. And this is really the extent that we know a world, is through this set of doors built into our carcass. So if we didn't have sight, sound, smelling, tasting, touching, and knowing, there would be no world for us. There would be no internal or external for us to know, for us to experience, us to identify as a world. But because we have these sense doors, we experience all these external contacts, and we suppose that is the world. But notice how when you close your eyes and seeing temporarily abates, that there's still the awareness of the fact that seeing is no longer there, or that there's just a little bit of darkness that you can be aware of. The awareness carries on. Even when there's not a particular sense object for awareness to cling to know, or to be aware of, awareness is this continuous thread which goes through all the experiences that we have of the world. By turning our attention inwards towards this, you could call it the theater of the mind. Think of your mind as like a cinema into which are projected sights and sounds, just like going to a big sit-down theater with popcorn and fizzy drinks. And so there's also odors, there's tastes, and there's tactile sensations, and they're all happening in this internal theater that you can be aware of. You can relate to it as such. So there's the theater, and then there's the knowing of the contents of the theater. And you don't have one without the other. But at the same time, it's possible to discern that there's a separation between the two. There's a difference between the contents of awareness and awareness itself. So this is the world in which we have to travel, that we have to study and make our journey in order to arrive at the end of it. So there is an end of the world where these experiences of rising and passing away, being born and dying, past and future, basically all categories don't really pertain. They're not part of the experience of that world, if you will. It's one way of putting it. And the Buddha refers in this somewhat elliptical way to the goal of the practice in many places throughout the canon. But he's very emphatic that the work that we do as practitioners is not work that we do in the external world. We all have to do work in the external world, but that's not that's not really our workplace when it comes to liberation, to coming to understand the truth of what the Buddha is pointing to. Indeed, we have to use the techniques that he gives us. And what he gives us are the Four Noble Truths. So in our world, this internal world that we're aware of, we can discern the arising of suffering. We can know that suffering is arising. We can know what suffering is. We can experience it. And we can recognize it. And we can simply abide with that knowledge that this is suffering. Maybe the this refers to physical pain, mental pain, disturbance, annoyance, emotional upset, restlessness, doubt. Any of those things can be experienced as unpleasant and unwanted, and you can feel the mind's hankering for it to go away, or hankering for something to be here that you're not experiencing. A desire for pleasure, a desire for some sort of sense contact, a desire for some mental or physical distraction to take you away from being bored. All of that is suffering. It is unsatisfactory. Suffering is a translation of the word dukkha, of course. And the word dukkha, etymologically, means something along the lines of that which is difficult to bear. So anything that you find difficult or unwanted or unlovely or unwantable and has a certain amount of emotional payload to it like that, that which is difficult to bear is suffering. And that which is suffering pushes the mind, causes the mind to try to wish to change things. But this really only happens, this desire to change things only really happens if we're not fully aware of the truth of suffering. The truth of suffering leads to the investigation that shows the cause of suffering. At first, it always seems as though suffering is happening from the outside world. And again, the suffering happens on the inside world, the world that you have to study and traverse in order to arrive at the Buddha's endpoint, at the goal of the teaching. So when we study internally, we see suffering, and then we also see that the cause of suffering is not just the external world. The external world doesn't make us suffer. With enough investigation, we can see that very consistently what happens is the world does whatever it does, and then we suffer in response. So the response of suffering is something that we're doing ourselves, that our own mind does. Our mind moves, and that movement is something that we can also observe. The movement has a cycle of being touched by the world, having either a pleasant or unpleasant feeling arise because of that contact. And because of that feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or even neutral, a boring feeling, being confronted with something which isn't very interesting. The mind will be prompted because of that feeling to either want more or want less or want different. But whatever it is, it's wanting. So the wanting, the desiring for things to be other than the way they are, this is actually the cause of suffering. So there's a volition involved there that's can be very subtle. And this is why we have to study the mind. It always starts with suffering because you can't actually get your interest up, and you can't actually follow the thread unless you have a starting point that's fairly compelling. And the unsatisfactoriness of the world is the very thing that we're trying to cure, that the Buddhist teaching is all about. So this cure that he's offering, the Buddha is sometimes called the great physician because he offers the cure for the disease of suffering. The cure is to study the mind, study how the mind moves, see how it is that it grasps at things, and that grasping itself simply leads it onward and onward and onward to more and more and different varieties of suffering and unsatisfactoriness. When the mind sees this clearly enough, it's able to drop it, literally choose differently. As long as we're choosing to pursue whatever it is that the mind's habitual agenda is, we're just going along with the habits of the mind that always lead to suffering. But when we're able to see clearly how it is that the mind is touched by the sense contacts, even sense contacts of thinking, probably one of the most potent causes of suffering is the mind's own habitual thoughts and emotional responses. When we can see that this kind of contact generates feeling, that feeling generates wanting, and that the wanting is only able to come up if we don't pay attention to it. If you watch wanting come up very carefully, if you see it happening in real time, you'll see that it requires a continual support. It can't sort of come up and hold itself up. It's constantly collapsing again. It'll come up and then it'll collapse. So the only way that wanting can be sustained is if we keep kind of putting energy into it, kind of believing it, if you will. And sustaining wanting leads to clinging, and clinging invariably leads to more suffering. When you see that your own habitual choices keeps inflating wanting or keeping it going, and you simply choose it differently, then the wanting collapses because that's its nature. It just rises and passes away. It's almost like wanting is designed to collapse immediately, and out of habit we keep it going. We keep it spinning even though it doesn't have to spin. The only way to get your hands on that particular volitional choice, however, is to see it happening for yourself in real time in your own mind. And the only way to get there is to study, just to watch your mind, to meditate, to practice, and to eventually see for yourself how it is that your mind generates wanting, and that wanting leads to suffering. So suffering and the wanting that causes suffering are this tight little loop that you can break. How do you break it? You simply stop choosing to want in that moment. You can't choose ahead of time. You can't decide now that you're never going to want again, but you can choose while wanting is arising in your heart. If you can see it, you can go, oh, look, there it is. And here's the thoughts that are sustaining it. This kind of inner narrative, or this inner emotional papancha, elaboration that we do with our minds. So we can choose not to do that, and as soon as we do, immediately the wanting collapses, and along with the wanting collapsing also collapses the sense of unsatisfactoriness. Wanting and unsatisfactoriness are very, very closely related to each other. And when there's no dissatisfaction, you could say that suffering is no longer there. So there could still be sense contacts, there could still be feeling, but without the wanting, there can't really be dissatisfaction. When you get the hang of it, you see that there's more and more circumstances and situations in which you can just drop it. You can just let it go. So when you see that letting go happen, then you're realizing the third noble truth. With the cessation of craving comes the cessation of suffering. So the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. The second noble truth is the truth of the cause of suffering, which is this desire, this craving for contact, craving for sense pleasure, craving for things to be different than they are. The third noble truth is seeing that when the craving is dropped, suffering itself vanishes. It might come back again, but nonetheless, it vanishes in this moment. And that's the only suffering that really counts, is the suffering you're having right now. And then the fourth noble truth is how you get there, which is the Eightfold Noble Path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, and I missed one. Right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. You don't have to practice them all simultaneously, but you do find that they all support each other. And the teachings that we have in this tradition and the techniques that we're practicing, and it's not just sitting on a cushion, and it's not just listening to Dhamma talks, but it's constantly, in effect, watching your mind as much as you possibly can to see how your mind is doing, what it's reacting to. Not taking your mind personally, but taking it as taking a personal interest in it to see what it's up to and see if you can catch the various ways that it causes itself to suffer, and then look for the ways to abandon those causes. When you're doing that, then you necessarily are employing all of the aspects of the Eightfold Noble Path. So there's like a simple, a succinct summary of the Eightfold Noble Path, which is sometimes summarized as abandon the unwholesome, cultivate the good, purify the mind. Right? So the way that you do that, of course, is to simply watch the mind and to constantly ask yourself, is what's coming up wholesome or unwholesome? Does it lead to my welfare and the welfare of others or not? If it's not leading to welfare, then see if you can abandon it. So all the teachings are they keep looping back to this same point. The way out is in. You have to study the mind, study the heart, see how things work in your own direct experience. And when you do that, eventually you'll see, in starting small at first, but eventually it starts to take over your whole world, you see how it is that you create all your own problems. And then you can solve all your own problems. And then you can abide with the world just the way it is without suffering. And that's a good place to arrive at. The more thoroughly, the more carefully, the more continuously you practice this, the more benefits that you get from the practice. And it doesn't necessarily change the outside world, because you're not necessarily trying to change the outside world. You're simply trying to change the inner world, the world that within this fathom-long carcass, the only world that we actually have access to, that we can actually influence to any great degree, the world that's always at our disposal, always ready for us to look. We look at that world, we study that world, and by doing our job, doing our journey in that world, we can arrive at the place where birth, aging, and death are no longer an issue or problem or a question. So that seems like a good place to call a break. I'll leave those thoughts with you. We can open up the floor for Q&A.
Sometimes you can feel bad. Sometimes you can suffer even without thinking.
Yes.
Do you agree? You can just feel bad without any thoughts.
Okay. And so your question is what's going on there? Something like that?
Yeah. I mean, I just think, well, suffering is not always the thinking mind. It's sometimes it's just a condition. Okay,
so then that's a really great question, because oftentimes we feel, I'd say the majority of us feel, that suffering merely afflicts us, and we don't really, we can't sort of see the cause and effect nature of it. We're not thinking about anything, we're not pursuing some sort of unpleasant topic, and yet we feel dreadful. We feel depressed or unhappy, various degrees of misery. And I think this is a fairly widespread phenomenon. A lot of people experience times like this in their life. And suffering is this signal that our minds are giving us to investigate more carefully. One of the key aspects of the Buddhist teaching is called the Principle of Causality, Paticca Samuppada. And this idea of causality can be summarized as when this is happening, that arises. As long as this keeps happening, that will continue to be there. When this ceases, that stops happening. With the cessation of this, that will stop. So it's that's a very broad generalization of this truth that everything that we experience does actually have causes, even if we don't know what they are. So this is, you might say, this is, excuse me, this is an area where we sometimes just have to have a certain amount of forbearance, and you could say faith, a confidence that there is something that's possible to discover, and we simply have to keep patiently looking. So there's lots of different ways to play around with this principle and discover deeper aspects of its truth. So if you're notice that you're feeling unhappy, you feel like you're suffering somehow, there's a sense of despair, depression, a feeling of there's no point carrying on, everything seems dull and empty and hopeless, that feeling of hopelessness. Yeah, I hope it's not COVID. Probably not. So I've been on quarantine for weeks now. When we're feeling that, when you're feeling that sensation of hopelessness, of emptiness, this is where your faith in the Buddhist teaching can come to your aid. If you've practiced, if you've studied, if you've listened to Dhamma, try to reflect on that and see if you can convince yourself to look more carefully at that suffering directly. You've got nothing to lose, really. If you're if you're feeling bad and you take a few moments and go sit someplace quiet and try to interrogate that suffering, ask yourself, what is it that I'm feeling? And have I ever felt it before? And How do I know it's suffering? Like, what is it that's bad about it? Does it hurt? If it hurts, how does it hurt? Where does it hurt? Is it constantly hurting, or does it have some variability to it? Does it, wax and wane? Does it get stronger and weaker? And as you investigate this, try experimenting with some of the wholesome practices. So as I mentioned during the talk, at any moment, your mind is generating some degree of thinking in normal conscious life. You're thinking either overtly or covertly about whatever's happening. So right now, for example, you might not be thinking about it, but part of you is aware of the posture of your body. And as soon as I mention that, then your awareness can go there and notice what your feet are doing, notice what your knees are doing, notice whether you're comfortable or not. That awareness isn't in the forefront of your mind until you direct your mind towards it. But it's available, and that information about the posture of your body is constantly flowing in to some aspect of your awareness. It's sort of in the back of your mind, and it's either stronger or weaker. As soon as you put your awareness on it, then you can examine it in detail. So this is what you're trying to do when you interrogate any kind of a feeling, is you're trying to put more attention on it to get a better idea of what's really going on there. Oftentimes when we're having an unpleasant feeling or we're feeling despair, it seems to de-energize us so much, and we feel a little intimidated by the idea of trying to investigate it because we're afraid of what we might find. It might make us feel even worse, especially if there's some haunting anxiety that underneath it all we're doomed, we're worthless, or we're unlovable, or something even furrier than that, something darker than that. So this well of darkness that's not uncommon in the human psyche can put us off our willingness to investigate. And this is where we need a certain amount of courage, of bravery, of fortitude, willingness to look, confidence in the Buddha's teaching, because those underlying spots in our psyche that can make us feel as though I shouldn't look there, I shouldn't go too deep, that can kind of put us off investigating, they don't change as long as you don't look at them. And the way into them is to simply invite by directing your attention in that direction. And you put your awareness on what it feels like to feel bad, and you start asking yourself, where does this bad feeling emanate from? You're much more likely to get some clues about its underlying causal chain. Another way to approach that is to a little more oblique. Try consciously, intentionally thinking of something good. Right? Like put your attention on something that ordinarily makes you feel good, like videos of puppies is a good one. Anything that's just sort of light, playful, non-threatening, and uplifting can be a starting point. Some very powerful ones can be recollecting your own goodness. So if you recollect generous acts that you've done in the past, kind words that you've offered other people, the devotion and dedication of your practice, anything like that that you recollect about yourself can also be a powerful antidote to sort of free-form suffering. And when you do that, you're not really trying to cure yourself. What you're trying to do is teach yourself. You're trying to see how it is that the mind is susceptible to modification. It can be whatever it's doing now can be modified by what you do in this moment. So if the mind is somewhat miserable in this moment, and then you start thinking about something good, the mind can't help it. It'll start cheering up. It'll become less heavy. And so you're studying the cause and effect nature of the mind by doing these kinds of things, and you're also, not incidentally, helping to relieve your suffering. So the way to address any kind of suffering, fundamentally, is to look at it very carefully and to study it and to see, try to see its causal nature, because that's the way in to seeing where the clinging is, because at the base of it all, there's some kind of a clinging to an idea, a belief, a notion of oneself, a belief in the past, something. The mind is clinging to something. And when you see that, and you can see the volitional aspect of that clinging, then there's a possibility of letting it go. And as soon as you let it go, there's relief. Even if the mind habitually clings at it again and again, it doesn't really matter. As long as you see the causal chain, then you start having the option to also let go. So that's some thoughts about that question. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Venerable. There's another question from Marjorie. Marjorie, would you like to unmute yourself, please?
Certainly, thank you.
Hello, Marjorie.
Hello, Venerable. Thank you so much for that talk, by the way. I found a lot of resonance in it. And as you were speaking, I know, you know, the emphasis is for us to understand the nature of our minds and through that our own suffering. But I'm wondering, just given what's going on in the world and there's so many difficulties, what are your thoughts about moving forward and then looking at some of those structural difficulties from a Buddhist perspective, and do the teachings address it? There are so many things that seem to be beyond our control in terms of what's going on and that are structurally rooted. Thank you.
Okay, Marjorie, I'm not sure I totally understood your question. You said, did you say things that are structural?
Well, I'm thinking about what's going on in terms of world events, the structural difficulties with racism, inequalities, and things that are beyond our control. As we look at what's going on worldwide in the States, and where people are really trying to change some of those difficulties. My question is, do we spend too much time in our own personal dynamics, and when do we address and when do we move forward to looking at some of those causes?
This is an excellent question, Marjorie. Thank you so much. The teaching itself is, you could say, sort of consciously constrained. The Buddha doesn't try to teach about politics, economics, agriculture, cosmology, astronomy. I mean, there's a lot of topics that he could say something about, but he chose not to. And if you think about it, it's very strategic for him to have done so. There's a famous sutta in which he talks about, he's in the forest with some monks, and he takes up a handful of leaves. And he says, what do you think, monks? Is this volume of leaves in my hand compared to the volume of leaves in the forest, how do they compare? And the monks say, well, the leaves in your hand are few, the leaves in the forest are many. And he says, in the same way, what I have seen through knowing and seeing through liberation is much, but what I've taught you is few. And why is that? Because that which I've not spoken about is not essential. It doesn't lead to liberation. It doesn't lead to the abandoning of the causes of suffering. It merely leads to more entanglement. He's not saying that entanglement is bad, but it's not what he teaches. What he teaches is very specific, very narrow. It has powerful implications for how it is that we manifest ourselves as participants in this world. You know, when someone works to purify their own heart, to liberate their own heart of the causes of suffering, they necessarily abandon hatred, resentment, bitterness, envy, blame. They abandon all these causes of suffering. They abandon greed, lust, they abandon delusion, They abandon the belief even in the idea that their own ideas are somehow right and the ideas of others are somehow wrong. Whenever the mind is entertaining notions like that, it's engaged in the world and it's not fully in contact with the truth. So this is maybe the metaphorical way of thinking about what the Deva asked the Buddha. You know, is it possible to travel to the place where liberation is? Now, can we use our body? Can we use our language? Can we use our action in the world to take us from where we are now to some happier place, some happier destination where none of this is a problem anymore? And the Buddha is saying, no, you can't do it in the outside world. It's not to say that the outside world doesn't matter, or that you should ignore it, that you shouldn't care about other people. That's not it at all. I mean, this is almost the inverse of that. What the Buddha is pointing out is that our usual way of relating to what's going on in the outside world is based on our habits, on our egoic points of view, on our training, on our conditioning, on our personalities. This is normal. That's what everybody is doing. And you can see the world's on fire despite that, or because of that, right? So us finding a more graceful way to be an ego trying to influence the world isn't what the Buddha teaches, right? What he's teaching is how to free your own heart from the causes of suffering. And when you do that, you remove yourself as a cause of suffering for others. So one of the things that we see in the world a lot is politically, for example, people develop an opinion about any topic, you know, pick one: abortion, global climate, racism, anything. And you'll always find there's two sides to it, right? One side believes X, the other side believes not X. And then they fight over it, right? So every side believes that they're right. And if you study them, a lot of them will have very cogent, well-reasoned arguments for why they're right. But again, this is all just struggling or striving in the world to try to travel from one location to another, some ideal, better location. And there's no end to that, because you can never actually arrive at the end of suffering in the world. You can only bring your own heart to stop creating suffering for itself. So in that sense, I'd say the Buddha doesn't tell us what we should think or what we should do in regard to something like structural, because it's almost too abstract to even talk about. What he tells us to do is much more at the pragmatic level. So study the heart, study the mind, but when you're dealing with the outside world, make sure that you're really, really carefully adhering to the 5 precepts, right? If you're very carefully not allowing yourself to hurt others, to mislead others, to take what doesn't belong to you, to impose yourself sexually on others, if you're being very, very diligent about that, then you're going to be a pretty positive, beneficent influence in the world of people that you actually contact, right? Not the people on the other side of the planet about which we can have you know, a sense of empathy because we hear about what's happening to them, or you know, in some other place. For sure, it's fine to be engaged and to want good things for everybody, to send metta to all beings. But as you mentioned in your question, we can't actually control what other people do, what other people believe, what other people think. If we try to hire the government to control what other people do and think, that always ends up not working so well. So to some extent, we simply have to accept that the world is the way it is, and then do our best. And our best is always going to be coming from a place of freedom from clinging to the self, freedom from being entangled with greed, hatred, and delusion. If we can do that, then as human beings in the world, we're going to be doing things which are beneficent and at least harmless. We won't be creating residue in the hearts of others with our words and our actions. And practically speaking, that's very, very good. I mean, you can sort of imagine if everybody would just do that, right, most of our problems would evaporate. You know, if everybody just simply regarded their fellow human being with kindness, with sympathy, with acceptance, and with an intention towards harmlessness, then yeah, you know, the world would be a wonderful place. But we can't change other people. We can only change ourselves, and that's what we have to do. When we change ourselves, we set an example, and we contribute to the world's welfare. Until we change ourselves, we're just participating in the world's delusion. So I hope that helps, Marjorie.
Thank you. I have much to learn.